Materie podcast. I am Stefan Schett, and this is the first time we record an episode in English. That's because my guest today is from Hungary. Krisztina Rozgonyi was the chairperson of the Hungarian Communication Authority. That is, until Viktor Orbán took power. We talk about how Orbán changed the country, how his system works, and how the Austrian media landscape should prepare in case of an autocratic takeover. Krisztina, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for the invitation. It's my honor to be here.
You are a communications scientist, but we can't speak about your career without talking about Hungary. What was your role in the Hungarian media landscape?
Wow, how should I explain? I played smaller roles, like a beginner, and in German we would say in the Gründungsphase. Not only specialized in law, but I think, very much dedicating being an activist in the Hungarian media scene during the 90s, end of 90s, and during the years of 2000s. Those were the years, the real transition years, when the internet was born. And we believe that the digital communication sphere and the digital media sphere would bring to Hungary the real democratic change, because of course Hungary was also suffering from the post-communist past, and especially in the field of media and communications, there was a lot to be changed even back then. So we really hope that the internet will bring that kind of opportunities, and especially I'm talking about not the internet in the sense we think about today, like the social media type of internet. That was basically unknown back then, but it was more about online journalism and online-only digital media, which was catering for the breakthrough, so to say. So I was there, and I was very happy to be there. And I was assisting several initiatives, the ever first online portals of Hungary, which became the lead online newspapers of the media scene, community radios, the ever first Roma radio, for example, in Hungary that existed, the ever first self-regulatory body for journalism and for online press. Also the transformation of copyright law. So I was there to support this, but also, as I said, I was very kind of dedicated to be part of that change. And then in 2004, I had the privilege to be nominated and elected to become member of the board of the Hungarian Telecommunications Regulator. In Austria, it is similar to one half of ComAustria. Mm-hmm. Because back then it was not a converged regulator. So I was there for the telecommunications part, but my responsibility was for the so-called convergence areas. So those areas which were in between media and telecommunications, so satellite, cable television, IP television, the whole digital switchover from analog to digital broadcasting and these kind of things. And I've stayed there up until 2010. In 2010, I was already elected being the chairperson of the authority. And then came the first big change, or the only big change, I would say, in democratic, the so-called illiberal turn of the country. And me and many of us who were in, so to say, high-level positions, we resigned. We did not want. I personally did not want it to go into a dirty fighting that was already there, and it was very obvious by then, basically by the mid of 2010, that there was no hope to fight a fight.
A fight with Viktor Orbán, right? Because when you talk about the illiberal turn, that's when he took power, and that's when his whole vision of illiberal democracy started to play out in Hungary.
Yes, it was his vision, but it was not only him, and it's still also today, it's not only about him, because it's a system, and they call it as a system, and they call it as the national cooperation system, I think these kind of labels do ring very, very bad rings, for example, in Austria, when something is labeled.
But don't you have the same term in your past as well?
No, this was the new kind of brand they brought it in. It's in the Hungarian abbreviation is NER, the NER system. This is the National Cooperation System. It basically means either you're with us or you are against us.
That sounds like corruption to me.
It means partly corruption, but it's corruption is just one part of that. It really means that this country is not anymore for anyone else who is critical, who has a dissent, who has opposition mindset or something like that. So you don't belong here. And that was the message, and that's still the message. So there are reasons we are talking here in Vienna and not in Budapest.
But what did happen 2010 and afterwards? How did you see that development in your country?
I'm sorry, I will now look into my notes because, I'm a lawyer, so I will always be very keen to be precise about the facts, so to say. So I think one of the key takeaways of the Hungarian case was, as we called it, the rapidity of the events. Because what happened basically in less than 6 months. So I'm looking now at the timeline of 2010 and, it's 14 years ago. It's so long time.
And it happened in 6 months in 2010.
Exactly. So Fidesz win the elections in April 2010 with over 50% of the votes.
And that's Orbán's party, just for listeners who don't know about Hungarian politics.
That's Orbán's party. And under the Hungarian election system, 50% plus of the popular votes meant 2/3 majority in the parliament. So that's that's how it translated. It was not about them. It was, that was the system in place. So that was not fabricated by Orbán. I'm not aware about the Austrian kind of election system in that, but the popular votes, they do not translate one-on-one into seats in the parliament.
Mm-hmm.
So
it's much more proportional in Austria than it is in Hungary.
Back then, the Hungarian system was fairly proportional, actually. Mm-hmm. It's not anymore. They have changed that. So that could not happen to them again, to take away that kind of power. But there are certain constellations when it could happen. And it did happen. So they won 2/3 majority in the parliament in April. The absolute first target point was the media. So that was their strategic kind of decision to focus on the media from the very first moment on. And it was not only Orbán, but he had an army around him who were basically preparing this kind of takeover.
And you mean by that oligarchs that bought up the media, or
nope.
What is that army?
Oligarchs came much later. Those were people loyal to him and loyal to the party who were preparing for this kind of, again, I would not call it change, I would really call it a takeover. So there was a person, actually a lady, who was meant to be the chair of the newly set up regulator, the regulatory body. She was preparing for this role for a decade by then. There were people who were meant to take over the public service broadcaster. There were people who were meant to take over the media subsidies funds. So there were, again, kind of an army, I would call.
Just a lot of different people preparing for their roles.
Who were trained to go on day 2 and take a position and take over that particular position. By July 2010, they already passed the new media law. So from April to July, they have passed the longest ever since legal document in media history in Europe there is no one country which has such a long media law as Hungary does.
And why is it that long? Because it states what you can say on TV, or what is the matter with the long text?
Democratic legal systems are based on mutual cooperation in a society, in the legal system, and also on a high level of trust in a society. So rule of law functions if there is a trust in the rule of law. They were not preparing for such trust. They were preparing for a war. And therefore, in a democratic country, laws are rather short, because there's a general assumption that the checks and balances, the democratic institutions, the society, and how the society works will put the interpretation behind the lines, so to say, in a democratic manner, in discourse, after several discussions, after making compromises and coming to a democratic solution. It was not the case in Hungary. They knew that there will not be this kind of cooperation or this kind of trust in the society, which would have needed their takeover. So for them, it was inevitable to regulate each and every aspect of the functioning of the media system to the last details.
But what changed back then? Because when we hear about Viktor Orbán's Hungary, we hear a lot about autocratic turns or illiberal turns. So how does that translate into media law?
And the media system, right. So, of course, the first question and the first kind of easy targets are the institutions. For them, back then, the crucial institution was the regulator. So they took over the media regulator and also the telecommunication regulator. They merged, and they gave to this regulator, some media scholars call it a superpower. So the media regulatory authority in Hungary has more staff than the one in the UK or in France or in Germany or any other media regulator you could compare it. So it has hundreds and hundreds of people working there. It has a budget that is bigger than the whole educational system budget in the country. And the regulator has powers to do whatever it wants.
And that means also close down unfriendly media against Orbán.
Absolutely, and they did.
So if I would reach out to critical journalism in Hungary today, would I still find anything?
Yes, you would. I would say you would find amazing, brave, great investigative journalists working in almost only in online media outlets. You would find 0 daily newspapers. You would find 0 regional newspapers. You would find 0 radio station that has a license. Only internet radio stations you could find. You would find 1 weekly newspaper, maybe 2. You would find the online news sources, and surprisingly, the second biggest or the biggest commercial television channel of the country, which belongs to the RTL group, which is the last piece with a true influence.
Because RTL is a German TV station.
Because RTL is a German station, and because RTL was not that much open for negotiations as other investors were, and also because that particular broadcaster had a newsroom and journalists on board who were brave enough over the past 14 years to say no to any kind of pressures.
What is that kind of pressure that you describe? What can the government do if you don't change course as Viktor Orbán wants you to change?
Buy you up. So that's the first thing. And that happened basically to everyone else. The other big commercial television channel that belonged to the ProSiebenSat.1 Gruppe back then, but this I will have to check whether. So this is a remark for us. Whether that was ProSiebenSat.1 when the deal happened, because there were also other investors. So the second biggest or other biggest commercial television channel was simply taken over by one of the oligarchs. Most of the media was taken over by the oligarchs. Those who were not open to sell were forced to close down because they did not get any more state relevant advertising money anymore. Also, big advertisers like retailers in the country were threatened, and are still threatened today, to advertise in those media outlets.
In the Orbán-friendly ones, or to not advertise in the Orbán-critical ones?
Not to advertise in the Orbán-critical ones. So there are several commercial, economic, and legal ways to pressure even private television, radio, or news outlets to align.
On what legal ground do they close down? Because what I hear from other autocratic systems and dictatorships, most usually it's closed down because of terrorism or something, like a very blatant lie. Is it the same in Hungary, or do you have a legal process with a bit better explanation?
It's more complicated than that. So, Hungary is still in the middle of Europe, so it's not that much easy. Where it's very easy is, for example, in the case of terrestrial radio stations. So they did not get a license, or the license is taken away or not renewed. So whenever I get into a car and drive in Hungary, and, when you switch on the radio, you still listen to FM radios, there is nothing else than government propaganda. So you can switch from A to 20. You can switch in between the stations. Funny thing, if you switch on, for example, at noon or at any time when you have the news, very often you will listen to the same wording of the news.
So all the different private stations have the same wording for government affairs.
Exactly.
That sounds like a dictatorship, to be honest.
It is. And how is that? Because they also took over the press agency, the National Press Agency.
What would be the Austrian press agency, the APA in Austria?
Exactly. So the Hungarian APA is publishing the news of the day, taken over all these stations and read word by word. So it's really, really kind of Orwellian experience to listen to radio, for example, in Hungary.
But how are people reacting to that? Because even if you like Orbán, I think there might be a lot of people who really are into autocratic politicians, even if they know they are autocratic. But people that are just right-wingers, but hear that every TV station, every radio station is using the same wording as the government, have to be skeptical about that, right?
No.
No. Nobody bats an eye about it in Hungary.
No, so there are definitely several people who don't believe this or who are not interested, but most people simply avoid news. This is also very interesting statistics. The latest results of the Reuters study, which is a comparative study, says that news avoidance in Hungary is over 40%. So people
For comparison,
simply,
do you know the value for Austria?
yes, unfortunately, 39.
Okay, so not a big difference in media trust.
And this is also one of the issues when we will come to the takeaways of the Hungarian story for Austria, that Austria should also be very, very worried about. Because news avoidance means that people are simply not interested in what is happening in terms of, politics, in terms of democratic institutions, because they have other problems in life. And they are interested in information that is relevant to their lives. And they believe that the media is not delivering that information, or they don't trust that information, and they avoid the news.
But distrust in media doesn't necessarily mean that they are not interested, but they don't trust the media system. So is there an alternative in, as you know, in many autocratic systems, they turn to social media and to random TikTok accounts talking about politics?
Absolutely. So the highest ratio of social media consumption in Europe is Hungary. So that also tells a lot, because then they are exposed to unfiltered information. They are exposed to unfiltered propaganda. They are exposed to several ways of disinformation. They are exposed to several other types of, so to say, aligned kind of news pieces. Because Orbán and the media experts, so to say, around the government also realized that the social media is the platform where they can reach their electorate. So by now, there are, for example, specific outlets financed by state money where they train social media influencers.
And by they, you mean?
The government.
Not the party, but the government for Viktor Orbán's policies.
For them, it's not anymore a big question to make a distinction what is party. What is aligned with the party and what is aligned with the government.
That's also autocratic to me.
Of course. So these institutions are financed by state money, so to say. It's not the money of the party. It's public money. And they train the next generation of media professionals, as they call themselves.
I'm a bit conflicted when I hear that, because on the one hand, I've talked to the head of the Liberal Party Momentum in Hungary, and he told me that there are a lot of proxy sites on Facebook and so on that spread fake news for Viktor Orbán and then are quickly shut down, and you just put up the next one. That there's more money in Hungarian disinformation than in any media advertisement system in Europe.
Absolutely right.
And on the other hand, the stories of, let me think about Iranians or now even Russians in the channels that they can still use social media as a counter movement to autocrats. So couldn't that be also a potential for good?
That's a very complicated but absolutely great question.
Thank you.
It goes way beyond Hungary. It's really about the essence of what to do about social media, its presence and its role in democratic societies or undemocratic settings. Because what have we learned? We mean the world. During the Arab Spring years, social media was the platform for democratic change. That was the platform for opposition. That was the platform for dissent. Everybody held all over the world social media being, offering the place for that. By 2016, and there were two momentums in 2016 in terms of global events. One was the Brexit referendum. The other one was the first Trump campaign, when the whole big world learned how social media can be misused. The Cambridge Analytica scandal, several other ways how the social media can be, I cannot use a better word, misused and abused for political reasons. Trolls, fake accounts, several ways of tweaking the feeds of social media platforms and misuse the system was tested and successfully tested for doing wrong in those occasions. So, for example, during the Trump campaign, there were several also well-documented incidents of Russian propaganda and Russian influence through social media in the campaign. The Brexit referendum was, we know by now how many political influences were there to turn the voters in favor of the Leave vote. Since then, regulating social media is high and on the top of the European legal and policy agenda, and a lot has changed. Still, social media platforms are really battlefields as of today, and this is something we have witnessed since the breakout of the Gaza war. We have seen the huge discrepancies between Elon Musk and the European Commission, for example, on debt matters and the spread of disinformation, for example, on X. So social media right now is seen much more a threat than an opportunity, because we also learned and do know by now that social media is basically killing quality media in so many ways.
I don't disagree with you on that, but isn't it in normal media systems, I'm talking democratic, liberal media systems, isn't it also the job of media companies to find out a way to still survive without state money and next to social media, or is that completely impossible?
I wouldn't say completely impossible, but I would say there's no level playing field. So the amount of money, the amount of advertising money social media platforms are siphoning out from the media markets, and especially from quality media outlets, it's really not comparable to any other systemic attacks on quality media. So the question is, how can you fight against that? Definitely not with the use of distorted, politically driven state advertisements, which we also learned, for example, in Austria, the so-called infamous Inseraten methods of influencing the media. But public money is certainly needed in the media in transparent, objectifiable subsidy systems and manners to support quality content production. The future of quality media, I think, is a very hard question. And I don't think that in 5 years from now, we will see as much quality media outlets as we could see today, or we could also, historically looking back, we have already seen a loss of enormous amount of quality media outlets who could not survive, especially in the middle range or in the small scale media outlets. So just an example, if I would be Guardian today, Guardian is struggling. Guardian is also struggling and looking for means of financing and trying to switch to behind the paywall model without losing audiences. There are no good answers. It's a struggle. And it's the Guardian.
And I think everyone knows that from personal user experience, more and more paywalls, more and more ad blockers and so on. So you can see how that changes the media system also in Austria.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I want to talk to you about the Austrian media system, but before that, you mentioned Donald Trump, and I was wondering before, who has learned from whom? Because on the one hand, you've told me that Viktor Orbán has prepared his army for a decade and then took over power, and then it went really fast. That's what reminds me about Donald Trump's re-election campaign right now, because I think he's doing the same thing. On the other hand, the Facebook proxy wars are something from the Trump playbook. So who has learned from whom, and what is the relationship between Trumpism and Orbánism?
There's a constant exchange. So there are several kind of real exchanges between the Republican Party and between Fidesz, especially in terms of techniques of media misuse, media abuse, and obviously social media is the key target in that sense. I don't think there is, one kind of answer that this specific skill was developed by here or there. What is, I think, even more important and kind of closer to us here in Austria is, for example, how Orbán and this Hungarian kind of army is importing the knowledge of abuse and misuse of the media, for example, to the Western Balkans. And there we have absolute hard evidence how Orbán and the cronies are investing in troll farms, in several other media outlets, which are aimed to maintain and to produce systemic disinformation, for example, in the Western Balkans, where Orbán has vested interests. So this kind of practice, this kind of skills are transferable, and they are well prepared to learn from each other and exchange among each other.
And it's a story that's coming to town maybe this year in Austria as well, because Herbert Kickl is also saying he wants to do it like Orbán. He always says that in his speeches. And what should we do now to prepare for a possible Kickl media capture, to say?
First, I would definitely recommend to investigative journalists in Austria to go to Hungary, to talk to colleagues and try to find out what is really going on in terms of exchange. Because I'm absolutely sure that there's evidence to find about this kind of exchanges and this kind of cooperation. I think it's really important for the Austrian media and for the Austrian journalists to be vigilant and also look into details, look into practices that were not obvious beforehand, and be very, very critical in whatever is going to happen, and try to see kind of the bigger picture where certain players, certain information, certain, opinions could come from, certain revelations, because I'm pretty sure we are going to see many kind of, breaking stories during the elections times. The first testing is going to be the European parliamentary elections. Do not underestimate, because that's also a very important battlefield.
Also for Vladimir Putin.
Of course. So I think, the good old journalistic techniques about reporting what is going on, good to have, but it's not enough. And it's absolutely crucial to see who wants to attack and in what way the Austrian public sphere.
When you talk about journalists being vigilant, I wonder what I would do if I would still be a non-party journalist, so full transparency here. Because when I have to worry about the economic performance of my media company compared to others that are all struggling, and you have the possible future of a candidate that will give you no money, zero money, and just copy the Orbán playbook, I'm not sure how to be vigilant other than reporting about it and hoping that it gains traction.
Vigilant also means that, just to give you an example, if you're a journalist, you live off and from the information you receive. You're a good journalist, so you do your source check, you have your, well-learned journalistic practice, how to do that, they won't be enough. So whatever type of information you would receive, you should be very, very critical about asking beyond the necessary, beyond the well-known, checking ways and techniques, who else could have an interest publishing this piece of information? And what kind of other type of power games could be in play if I would run this story? So what I'm trying to say is this year in Austria, I think will be really, really important in the sense that all these power games, the Russian power games, the Orbán power games, the Trump power games, the Israeli power games, and so many others, Austria is very important for all these power players. And the Austrian media system, as we know it, is also suffering of several vulnerabilities. So be absolutely aware that they know their lessons, they learn their lessons, they know how to manipulate systems where they do know where to look for the vulnerabilities.
But when you say you have to be conscious about the power play with a story, I think there are two ways to go from there. Because on the one hand, let's go with an example. If I stand with NEOS, so I think when you report about corruption in the government or corruption at the Freedom Party, that might be good for us. And we have an election campaign, so in the power play, it's very good for us. A journalist should ignore that or be conscious about it, because I think the reflex in Austria is often to criticize everyone a bit, so you're in the middle and you can't be attacked for your position. Or are you saying that you should take a position in a global power struggle and be conscious about what could happen with the story?
I think there's no way not to report about. That's the imperative for a journalist to publish an information that has public relevance. And if it's a valid, it's a checked information, there's no way not to publish. But to be aware about the context. And I think, I'm not a journalist, I'm just a lawyer. Timing, source of information, the way of presenting information, the way, for example, an opposition party like the NEOS could be played against the bigger parties and try to be manipulated to play against these parties. So these kind of contexts and this kind of awareness will be super important for someone working, for example, for an opposition party.
My personal, final boss of media regulation is the question how to secure public broadcasting against authoritarian regime change. Because on the one hand, I think that we need public broadcasting, but it's also a very media giant, and it's very hard for private media to compete with those. So how do you have democratic control over the public broadcast without leaving an opening for someone like Viktor Orbán or Donald Trump or Herbert Kickl to come and change everything? Do you have an answer for that? Because I think it's an impossible question.
It's an almost impossible question, but I think we will agree that there are some possible answers and also even more no-go zones that we could definitely agree on. So first of all, I would say Austria should be very, very happy and absolutely proud having ORF as a trustable medium. With all the problems ORF is suffering of and from, ORF is still a very important source of information and trustable information. This is a value, and this value should be protected. And in the context of the globalized social media, tech giants driven media and communication environment, to forbid ORF to go broader on the digital sphere, and I'm, for example, mentioning here the limitations on ORF's online presence, is an absolutely no-go zone. This is a very, very bad decision. I'm sure we could have discussions about this with the NEOS, because I know that the NEOS could have different opinions about that, but I want to emphasize here that the ORF case should be not seen only in the Austrian context, but it should be seen in the global context, because the Austrian users, the Austrian citizens, the Austrian voters are not closed in the Austrian media sphere. They are open to the whole global information flow scheme. And the piece of information by the ZIB Instagram account that is reaching the Austrian citizens with reliable information is competing against everything else that is coming from all over the world. So in that particular context, the protection of ORF is inevitable. On the other hand, it's very important to look at the Austrian context, of course, and see the limitations of the Austrian non-ORF media market and look into the possibilities of diversity and pluralism in the non-ORF media market. We know that there is an enormous amount of public money going into the private media sector. A smaller portion of this is through the Medienförderung system, a bigger portion of that money through the state advertising, the so-called Inseraten. At this very moment, none of these systems are prioritizing quality media. And that's the problem. Because if we want to protect and open up and diversify and make it competitive and be able to, I won't say challenge the ORF hegemony, but definitely offer different and diverse value points, then the Austrian policy-driven subsidy schemes, the Austrian state-governed financing methods should be absolutely reconceptualized and focus on quality instead of quantity, so to say.
I think I'm aligned with you when it comes to relevancy of public broadcast information. But another problem that we have in Austria, I'm curious if you think that as well, is that you can't really criticize the ORF without getting attacked because you do Kickl's business. Because every attack on the public broadcast weakens public broadcast, and that leads to authoritarian governance. And I'm not sure that's the case, because I agree that we need public broadcast and it's good to have reliable information. We get that with ORF. I completely agree. On the other hand, it's a lot of money, and I'm not sure they need that much money to do that, because there are Instagram accounts TikTok accounts in Austria that reach 6 million people. That's crazy. So you don't need that many people doing that much to reach the Austrian people, I think. But when I say that, it's always like ORF bashing, or why do you want to weaken public broadcast? I don't want to do that. I just want to criticize in order to make it better. Is that also your perception of our public media discourse?
I absolutely agree with you. This discourse is not constructive. This discourse is really black and white, and I think that's a crucial problem. In my personal view, this discourse is suffering of discussing alternatives. It's like more or less ORF, and that's the discussion about. It's not how ORF could be different, how ORF could be more efficient, how ORF could be more focused, how ORF could be better regulated, not more, but better regulated. What kind of alternatives could be there to kind of bring ORF to cooperate with other actors of the media market? So not to be the competitor for new entrants, but to be a cooperation partner for startups. So what I am missing from this discourse is the kind of creative thinking, how we could do it differently. And it's not about either or, but how we could work and do it together. And I'm very much agree that this kind of approach of not fighting each other is very much missing.
I'm not sure how long you've been to Austria now, but what you say reminds me of many topics in our political discourse. We also do that with taxes, more or less. We don't care how to make the system better, just more or less taxes. Or more or less EU. We don't care about EU reforms, just tell me more or less Europe. Is that a general problem in politics?
So I live here with my family this is the 9th year. We came together with the Flüchtlinge-Welle, wortwörtlich, I would say. So we arrived to Austria on the 31st of August 2015 when the borders were closed.
I remember that day even. That was the day when the Viennese mayor spoke at the Westbahnhof. Yeah, that was the day of the Flüchtlingswelle.
That was absolutely. And just to give you, some colorful details, we have left Budapest in the morning. It was an awfully hot day, so it was like around 40 degrees. We all sat into our family car, which was not a super big car because we are 4 of people and we have 2 daughters. So there were the 2 daughters. It was the 2 of us with my husband. There was the dog, there was the bunny, and there was absolutely everything you could imagine, from our kids' books to the last, kuscheltier, whatever you can. So the car was packed up until, the roof. And we were already on the highway towards Vienna, and we heard on the radio, on the internet radio, that Austria closed the borders because obvious reasons, and there's no way to enter Austria from Hungary. And that was, middle of the day. It was awful heat, and you are stuck with kids, with the bunny, with the dog, on the highway. So what do? Many people got into panic, obviously. We tried to avoid that, so we were driving backwards, and I'm not joking, for 3.5 kilometers long to go to a side street and go and take the direction towards Bratislava and come to Vienna through Bratislava. And that was an awful day. I told my husband, we did not know how it happened back then in 1956. But I could imagine that people on the road from Hungary towards Austria, fleeing Hungary, were as much devastated as we felt back then. But we made it. So, back to your question, I am very much interested in understanding how Austria, culturally, politically, in all possible means. I read a lot, I watch, I listen, and I also talk to people. And I very much have the feeling that there's an ongoing fight between the good and the bad Austria. And this ongoing fight is sometimes heartbreaking to witness, because this is a wonderful country, and this country has amazing potentials. And this fight is so much not worse, because there are real enemies out there. And the strengths of this country, the potentials of this society could be and should be used to fight those real enemies instead of fighting against each other.
Damn, that's a good answer. You should go into politics. When we talk about a hopeful message like that, it brings me maybe to my last question. I'm not sure if you can keep up the hope, though, because when you look at your old home in Hungary, do you have any hope that in the foreseeable future, at least, things will get better, more democratic, more liberal again? Or is it, in the meantime, becoming a closed authoritarian system?
This is, again, thank you, a very good question, but it's a very hard answer. And I cannot give you any, scientifically, academically evidenced answer.
It's a message about a feeling.
What I could tell you is rather a personal kind of answer to that. So we made the decision to leave Hungary not because we liked that, but because we thought that we did not wish to bring up our daughters in a system which was not fair, which was not democratic, and where we could have survived. We have several friends. There are wonderful people who stayed in Hungary and also fight the system as much as they can. But I was brought up in a system which we call the double-speak system. So that was the end of the communist time, so during the 80s. So there was one narrative you were listening to in the school. There was one narrative you could hear from the television, from the radio, and there was another narrative which you had in your family. If you lived in a family which was, which was critical, and by the 80s, most families were critical of the system. It was an awful way of getting used to this double-speak standard. And by the end of the 80s, so I'm talking about 88, we already had the hope that it will change at some point. And then we could witness, we could see the Berlin Wall to fall, and we had amazing momentums in our lives. And obviously big hopes for the future. I don't think that there's any autocratic system that could last forever, and I don't think Orbán's system would last forever, but the damage it has done to the country, the damage it has done to the social fabric of the Hungarian society, which was anyways a very, very vulnerable and very fragile society, this damage will last much, much longer than I could bear, for example. So I personally do not plan to return to Hungary even if Orbán would fall. Of course, I'm visiting. My parents are there, my friends are there. My childhood is there, my roots are there, my mother tongue, my language is there, the culture and everything. But I don't think that in my active life, so to say, it could be reparable to a level that I could cope with. And I am a person I'm a builder. I go to places, I want to do things, I want to work with others, I love teamwork, I love team building, I love to do things from scratch and take it to one or two. I'm not that type of freedom fighters who I really admire, who stayed in Hungary and on a daily basis fight those fights. It's not me. I am very proud of them. But a system which would appreciate building, I don't see it in my active years of life, so to say.
But you're still doing some part in explaining what happens in Hungary to Austrians. It was a pleasure having you here. I think we learned a lot, and thank you for being my guest.
Thank you very much for the invitation.